The little black girl told the biker her mom's signal pinged from a sealed unit behind the old fuel yard. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It starts on a quiet evening that quickly turned into one of the most intense nights of a biker's life. A little girl, no older than 10, ran toward a group of bikers parked outside an old diner in a small town. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She was panting, eyes wide with fear, looking over her shoulder as if someone, or something, was chasing her. "Please help me," she gasped, clutching at the nearest biker's jacket. "They took my mom. I think she's in trouble. She sent me a signal, but they're going to hurt her." The bikers, who had been enjoying a quiet meal after a long ride, froze. They weren't used to this, but something in her voice, something in the desperate look in her eyes, made them all listen closely. The girl, between sobs, explained that she had been at the old fuel yard with her mom earlier that day when she noticed something strange. Her mom's phone pinged, a signal from a location she shouldn't have been. The signal came from behind a sealed unit, one that had been abandoned for years. The moment she realized it, her mother had asked her to leave, telling her to run, and that she would be fine. But the girl knew better. Her mother never asked her to leave unless something was terribly wrong. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to be alone. That's when the girl ran straight to the bikers. Her mom's signal had pinged from the sealed unit, and now she was missing. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, the air heavy with tension. They didn't need to say much. Everyone knew what had to be done. This wasn't just a simple rescue. This was something more. These bikers didn't hesitate. They were a family, and family meant everything. A promise was a promise, and one of their own, no matter how distant, needed them. The group leader, Jake, a tall man with a weathered face and hands scarred from years of work and life on the road, stepped forward. "We don't leave people behind," he said, his voice low but firm. "Let's gear up and ride." Within moments, the bikers were ready. The girl, still trembling, was placed on the back of one of the bikes. "We're going to find your mom," Jake promised her, looking over his shoulder as the group revved their engines. The roar of the motorcycles broke the silence of the night as the group rode off into the distance, headed for the old fuel yard. No one knew what they would find when they arrived, but one thing was certain. They weren't backing down. Not now, not ever. The sound of roaring engines cut through the crisp night air as the group of bikers thundered down the highway, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Jake, the leader, glanced over at the girl riding behind him. She was still trembling, clutching the back of his leather vest, her face pale with fear. They had been riding for almost 2 hours now, the old fuel yard still miles away, but the girl's urgency was palpable. "Please, hurry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They're going to hurt her. My mom. I don't know what they're doing to her." Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars. His mind raced, but he kept his focus on the road ahead. He couldn't afford to lose his composure, not now. The rest of the crew followed close behind, their bikes a steady line of roaring power, each rider fully aware of the gravity of the situation. They weren't just riding for a friend. They were riding to save a child's mother. For Jake and the others, this wasn't just another job. This was personal. Jake had been in situations like this before, though never with stakes this high. There was something about the girl's desperation, her pleading eyes, that made everything feel different. His thoughts kept returning to the signal, the one that had pinged from behind the sealed unit at the fuel yard. What was so important about that place? Why would the girl's mother send a distress signal from there? It was an abandoned lot, a place no one visited anymore. And now, it seemed, something was lurking in the shadows, something dangerous. "Almost there," Jake muttered, as the group neared their destination. The old fuel yard was just ahead, its rusted tanks and crumbling buildings barely visible in the distance. A few scattered lights flickered around the perimeter, giving the place an eerie, haunted look. It felt like a forgotten corner of the world, a place where time had stopped. Jake slowed his bike as they approached the yard. The crew followed suit, engines rumbling softly as they rolled to a stop. The only sound now was the wind and the distant hum of city life far behind them. The girl slipped off the bike, her feet landing softly on the gravel. She hesitated, looking up at the dark buildings ahead. "This way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake and the rest of the bikers exchanged wary glances. They knew they were about to step into something they weren't prepared for. "Stay close," Jake ordered, as the group made their way toward the sealed unit behind the old fuel yard. The girl led the way, her steps quick and nervous. As they walked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His senses were on high alert, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The closer they got to the sealed unit, the more tense the air became. It wasn't just the danger of the unknown that unsettled him. It was the eerie silence. No sounds of animals, no wind rustling the leaves. Just the quiet of a forgotten place, filled with secrets. When they finally reached the sealed unit, the girl stopped. She pointed to the large metal door, its edges rusted and covered in layers of grime. "That's where I saw her," the girl whispered. "She was there, behind that door. But they locked her in." Jake crouched down, inspecting the door closely. The lock was old, but it was still secure. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had no idea who or what was behind that door, but they had to get inside. He stood up and turned to the crew. "We need to move fast," he said. "One of you, get on the radio and call for backup. The rest of you, get ready." With that, Jake pulled a crowbar from his bag. The crew immediately spread out, watching their backs as Jake worked the crowbar into the door's lock. Every second felt like an eternity. The girl stood to the side, her eyes wide with fear as she watched the bikers prepare to open the door. Then, with a loud, echoing crack, the door swung open. The darkness inside was thick, impenetrable. Jake stepped inside first, his hand on the handle of his knife. The others followed, their footsteps silent on the dusty floor. The air smelled stale, like it had been locked away for years. As Jake moved deeper into the unit, he heard a soft rustling sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His hand tightened around his knife as the rest of the crew fanned out. What they found next was something none of them had expected. At the far end of the unit, tied to a chair, was the girl's mother. She was unconscious, her clothes torn, her body bruised. But what really shocked them was the small, blinking device strapped to her wrist. It looked like a tracking device, something that didn't belong in this rundown unit. Jake's heart sank as he took in the scene. This was no random abduction. Whoever had done this had planned it carefully, and they were still out there. The danger was far from over. The bikers stood frozen for a moment, taking in the sight of the woman tied to the chair in the dark, abandoned unit. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he surveyed the scene, his mind racing. The girl's mother was unconscious, her body bruised and battered. But what was even more disturbing was the small, blinking device attached to her wrist. It was a tracking device, unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. "This isn't just some random kidnapping," Jake muttered, his voice low and grim. "Whoever did this is watching us." He turned to his crew, his expression hardening. "We need to get her out of here. Now." The bikers moved quickly, two of them rushing to untie the woman while the others kept watch, scanning every corner of the unit. The girl stood to the side, her hands clasped together tightly in front of her, her face pale with worry. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake crouched down in front of her, offering a reassuring smile, though inside he was anything but calm. "She's strong," he said, his voice steady. "We'll get her out of here." He looked back at his crew, giving them a silent signal to get ready. The woman's hands were bound tightly, and it took a few minutes to loosen the ropes. As they did, one of the bikers, a large man named Bear, scanned the room. "Something's not right," Bear muttered, his eyes narrowing. "We need to move fast." As soon as the woman was free, Jake gently lifted her into his arms. "Let's go," he said. "We can't stay here." The bikers quickly made their way toward the exit, but just as they reached the door, they heard a noise. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from the shadows. "We've got company," Jake hissed. He motioned for the crew to stop, and they immediately went on high alert, looking around the dark unit for any signs of movement. The sound grew louder, and then, through the dim light, a figure stepped forward. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face hidden in the shadows. You should have stayed out of this, the man said, his voice cold and steady. You're not leaving here alive. The bikers quickly assessed the situation, their instincts kicking in. They had no choice but to fight. Jake stepped forward, keeping the woman safe behind him, while the rest of the crew moved into position. We're not here to start trouble, Jake said, his voice calm but firm. We're just here to get her out. You don't want to mess with us. The man chuckled darkly. You think I'm afraid of a bunch of bikers? He sneered. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. The sound of the weapon clicking into place echoed in the silence, and the tension in the room grew thick. The bikers, however, were undeterred. They had faced far worse situations in the past. They weren't backing down now. Just as the man raised the gun, a motorcycle engine roared outside, its sound growing louder by the second. The man hesitated, turning his head toward the noise. That was all the opening the bikers needed. In an instant, Bear lunged forward, knocking the gun from the man's hand and sending him crashing to the ground. The other bikers quickly moved in, securing the man and making sure he wouldn't be a threat. Jake stood over him, his fists clenched, ready to deliver a knockout punch. Who are you? Jake demanded. The man grinned, his eyes cold and calculating. You're in deeper than you think, he said. There are others, and they won't stop until they've taken everything from you. Before Jake could respond, the sound of more engines filled the air. This time, it wasn't just one bike. It was a whole group, roaring down the road toward the yard. We've got more company, Jake said, his voice tense. Get the woman out of here now. He turned to the rest of the crew, motioning for them to make their way to the bikes. As they rushed out of the unit, the woman still unconscious in Jake's arms, the bikers quickly loaded her onto one of the bikes. The engines roared to life as the group sped off into the night, the sound of the approaching bikes growing louder behind them. Jake's heart raced as he looked over his shoulder, knowing they had just made a dangerous enemy. Whoever was after the woman, they weren't going to stop. But Jake wasn't about to let anyone hurt her again. Stay close, he told the girl as they rode off into the night. We're getting you both out of here. The sound of engines filled the night air as Jake and the bikers sped through the empty streets, their bikes roaring like thunder. The woman, still unconscious, was securely strapped to the back of one of the motorcycles, with the girl riding close behind. Jake's eyes darted around, constantly scanning the road ahead, his mind racing. The group had barely escaped the sealed unit when they heard the rumble of more motorcycles closing in behind them. Whoever was chasing them wasn't going to stop. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars, determination flooding his veins. We're not losing her, he muttered under his breath. The girl, clinging to the back of Jake's bike, was silent, her face pale. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was also a hint of hope in them now. They were getting away, at least for now. But Jake knew they couldn't outrun their enemies forever. They had to make a plan. They needed answers, and they needed to stay ahead of whoever was hunting them. The night was thick with tension, the kind of tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break. The sound of approaching engines grew louder. It wasn't just one or two bikes. It was a whole gang, their roar unmistakable. Jake looked in his rearview mirror, spotting a group of black leather jackets closing in fast. They're on us, he said, his voice grim. Get ready. The bikers ahead of Jake formed a tight formation, blocking the road as they prepared for whatever was coming. The girl's eyes widened. Are they going to hurt us? She asked in a shaky voice. Jake glanced back at her, his expression hardening. Not if we have anything to say about it. As the other bikers fanned out to create a defensive line, Jake kept his focus on the road ahead, anticipating the moment when their pursuers would make their move. Sure enough, the sound of motorcycles grew deafening as the other gang appeared in the distance, headlights piercing the darkness like predatory eyes. They were closing in fast, and Jake knew this was no ordinary chase. Whoever these people were, they were out for blood. The first of the enemy bikers made his move, roaring forward and heading straight for Jake's crew. Without hesitation, Jake slammed the throttle forward, kicking his bike into high gear as he sped toward the oncoming gang. The girl screamed in surprise, but Jake held her tight, his focus unwavering. As they collided with the enemy gang, the noise of engines and screeching tires filled the air. The bikers exchanged blows, their heavy leather jackets and studded vests clashing with the enemy's gear. Jake's eyes locked onto the man at the front of the gang, the one who had been threatening them earlier. The man sneered, clearly expecting a fight. "You should have stayed out of this," the man spat, his voice dripping with malice. But Jake wasn't backing down. With a growl, he accelerated, his bike surging forward as he knocked the man's motorcycle off course, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The rest of the gang hesitated for a moment, thrown off by Jake's sudden attack. But they quickly regrouped, determined to take down the bikers and claim victory. The fight raged on as the two groups clashed, their bikes skidding and roaring through the streets. Despite being outnumbered, Jake and his crew fought with a fierce determination, protecting the woman and the girl with everything they had. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber and gasoline as punches were thrown, motorcycles collided, and metal screeched against metal. But even as the battle raged, Jake knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They had to make their escape. He scanned the area quickly, searching for an opening. That's when he spotted it, the old bridge up ahead, the one that led into the forest. It was narrow, hidden from the main roads, and would give them a chance to lose their pursuers. "This way," Jake shouted to his crew. He revved the engine, heading toward the bridge with the girl and the unconscious woman still behind him. The bikers quickly followed, their engines roaring as they charged toward the narrow passage. The enemy gang was right behind them, but Jake wasn't going to let them catch up. As they reached the bridge, Jake felt a jolt of relief. The narrow path would make it harder for the enemy to follow. But as they crossed, the sound of motorcycles grew distant, and a sense of dread settled over Jake. This wasn't over. Whoever was behind this, they were still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars. He wasn't about to let that happen, not while he still had breath in his lungs. He looked back at the girl, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "We're getting you both to safety," he said, his voice low and firm. The girl nodded, her grip tightening on the bike. "I know you will," she whispered. As the bikers disappeared into the night, the sound of the engines faded, but the danger still lingered in the air. They had won this round, but the real battle was just beginning. The bikers continued down the narrow bridge, their engines roaring against the silence of the night. Jake kept his focus on the road ahead, the hum of the engines and the beat of his heart, the only sounds breaking the stillness. The girl and her mother, still unconscious, were now safely behind him. But that didn't mean the danger was over. Jake's thoughts raced as they made their way deeper into the woods, the only light coming from the bike's headlights cutting through the darkness. The enemy gang was still out there, hunting them, and Jake knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. His grip tightened on the handlebars, his mind running through every possible scenario. He needed to find a safe place, a place where they could regroup and figure out their next move. As they reached the edge of the woods, the path ahead opened up to a small clearing. Jake slowed the bike, signaling for the rest of the crew to follow. The rest of the bikers pulled up behind him, forming a protective circle around the woman and the girl. "We need to make a plan," Jake said, his voice steady but urgent. "We're not safe here for long. The enemy's out there, and they'll be looking for us." The bikers dismounted, scanning their surroundings with practiced eyes. The forest around them was dense, the trees tall and looming, but it was quiet. Too quiet. "I don't like this." Bear, one of the larger bikers, muttered as he paced around the clearing. "We've been running all night, and we still don't know who we're up against. We need intel." Jake nodded. He was right. They had no idea who the enemy really was or why they were after the woman and the girl. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a random attack. The woman had been marked, targeted. Jake turned to the girl, who was standing next to him, clutching her mother's hand. "Do you know who did this?" Jake asked softly, his tone gentle. The girl shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know why they took her. They've been watching us for weeks." Jake's brow furrowed. "How do you know that?" The girl bit her lip, looking down at the ground. "I've seen them," she said. "At the grocery store, at the park, always watching. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to scare my mom." Jake's heart sank. This was bigger than they thought. Whoever was behind this wasn't just after the woman. They were after the whole family. He glanced at his crew, his mind working through their options. "We need to get the woman medical attention," Jake said, his voice firm. "But we can't risk taking her to a hospital. Not yet." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew that hospitals were risky. With the enemy's reach, they could be waiting for them at the front door. "We'll need to find a safe place," Jake continued. Somewhere off the grid. We'll lay low, get the woman patched up, and figure out our next move. The crew nodded, their expressions serious. But where do we go? Phantom, one of the bikers, asked. Jake thought for a moment. There's a cabin out in the hills, he said. It's isolated. No one knows about it except for us. It'll buy us some time. He looked at the rest of the crew. It's our best shot. The bikers immediately got to work, securing the area and preparing for the journey. Jake helped the woman onto one of the bikes, keeping her close as they made their way through the winding trails of the forest. The girl stayed close behind him, her face still pale, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes now. They had made it this far. They could make it the rest of the way. As they traveled deeper into the woods, Jake kept his guard up. The path was treacherous, narrow, and twisting, but they pressed on. The darkness seemed to close in around them, the shadows from the trees stretching out like fingers. Every sound made Jake's senses sharpen, his grip on the handlebars tightening. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not now. Not when they were so close. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the cabin. It was a small, secluded place, hidden deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. Jake and the bikers helped the woman inside, making sure she was comfortable and settled on a makeshift bed. The girl, still holding her mother's hand, sat beside her, watching over her as if she were afraid to let go. The bikers took turns keeping watch outside, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. Jake stood near the door, his mind racing as he tried to piece together everything that had happened. Whoever was behind this, whoever had been watching them, wasn't going to give up. The woman was just the beginning. They were coming for the girl next. Jake turned to the crew, his voice steady but filled with urgency. We have to stay ahead of them. We can't let them get close. He paused, looking out the window into the dark woods. We're not safe yet. The silence in the cabin was almost suffocating. The only sound was the soft crackling of the small fire Jake had started in the corner of the room. The woman, still unconscious, lay on the makeshift bed. The girl was sitting by her side, her small fingers tightly gripping her mother's hand. Jake stood near the door, his eyes scanning the dark woods outside. He knew that the safety of the cabin wouldn't last long. It was just a matter of time before the enemy caught up with them. Every second they stayed here, they risked being found. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed to figure out who was behind all of this, and why. He turned to the rest of the crew, his voice steady but filled with urgency. We need to get some answers. The woman can't stay unconscious for long. We need to find out who's after her and why they're after her daughter. Bear, one of the bikers, nodded. But how are we supposed to do that? We've been on the run for hours, and we're not any closer to finding out who's behind this. Jake clenched his fists, frustration simmering beneath the surface. I know, but we can't afford to sit here and wait for them to come to us. We need to take the initiative. He turned toward the girl, who was still sitting beside her mother, her face pale with worry. What can you tell us about your mother's situation? Anything that might help us figure out who's behind this? The girl looked up at Jake, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. I don't know. I don't know why they're after us. My mom, she's always been careful. She never let anyone get too close. She paused, as if searching for the right words. But lately, she's been acting different. She started getting these strange phone calls. She wouldn't tell me who they were from, but I could tell she was scared. Jake's mind raced as he processed the information. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it was something. Do you know what the calls were about? Was there a specific threat? The girl shook her head. No, she wouldn't tell me. She said it was nothing, but I knew it wasn't. She was always so careful with her phone. She never let anyone track her. Jake's heart sank. The fact that the woman had been getting strange phone calls meant that someone was already targeting them before everything had escalated. This wasn't just an act of random violence. It was something much bigger. We need to find those phone records, Jake muttered. If we can figure out who was calling her, we can figure out who's behind all of this. Bear stepped forward. How do we get those records? We're out in the middle of nowhere. Jake's eyes flicked to the girl. Do you have your mother's phone? If we can find it, maybe we can track down the calls. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with hope. I think I saw it in her bag, she said, standing up and moving to where her mother's belongings were scattered on the floor. She quickly rummaged through the bag, pulling out a small black phone. She handed it to Jake, who immediately began checking the device for any sign of recent activity. He scrolled through the messages and found several missed calls from an unlisted number, all occurring over the past few days. The calls were all at odd hours, late at night or early in the morning. Jake's fingers hovered over the screen, trying to access the phone's recent call log. But then, something caught his eye. There was a message, sent just a few hours ago. He tapped it open, his heart pounding. The message was brief, but chilling. "You're running out of time. We'll find you. We always do." Jake's stomach dropped as he read the words. This was no ordinary threat. Whoever was behind this had been watching them for a long time. They knew where they were, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. "We're being hunted," Jake said, his voice grim. "And they're getting closer." The rest of the crew gathered around, looking over Jake's shoulder at the screen. The girl's face drained of color as she read the message. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Jake looked at her, his expression hardening. "We fight back," he said firmly. "We've been running long enough. It's time to take the fight to them." The bikers nodded in agreement. They had been on the defensive long enough. It was time to stop hiding and take control. "We'll need a plan," Jake continued. "We can't just charge in without knowing who we're up against. We need intel. We need to be smart." He turned to Bear. "Get in touch with our contacts. See if anyone knows anything about this group. We need to find out who they are and what they want." Bear nodded and stepped outside to make the call. Jake turned back to the girl and her mother. "We'll keep you safe," he said, his voice soft but filled with determination. "But we need to know everything. If you remember anything else, anything at all, you need to tell us." The girl nodded, her eyes still filled with fear, but there was a new sense of hope in them. For the first time, it seemed like they had a chance. They weren't just running anymore. They were going to fight, and they were going to win. The night was growing colder, and the tension in the air was palpable. The bikers sat around the small cabin, the dim light of a lantern casting shadows on their faces. Jake paced back and forth, his mind racing as he thought through the plan. They had learned a lot since they had taken the woman and her daughter in, but it wasn't enough. The enemy was still out there, closing in on them, and they needed to be ready for whatever came next. He stopped in front of the door and glanced out into the darkness. It had been hours since Bear left to make contact with their allies, and still, no word had come through. Every minute felt like a lifetime. Inside, the girl sat quietly by her mother's side, her eyes still wide with fear. The woman was resting, her pulse steady but her breathing shallow. The injury she had sustained was serious, but Jake knew they had to keep her alive long enough to get answers. He turned back to the crew, his voice low and urgent. "We need to act fast. We can't keep waiting around here. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely they'll catch up to us. We need to hit them first." Bear had returned by then, his face grim as he walked in through the door. "I talked to our contact," he said. "This is bigger than we thought. There's a whole network behind this. They're after the girl and her mom for something. I don't know what, but it's serious. And they won't stop until they have them." Jake's eyes narrowed, his mind quickly processing the new information. "Do you know who these people are? Where they're operating from?" Bear shook his head. "Not exactly, but we know they've got eyes everywhere. They've been tracking us, and they know we're here. It's just a matter of time before they come looking." Jake took a deep breath, his mind working through the options. They couldn't just keep running. They needed to take control of the situation. They needed to find out exactly who was behind all of this and what they wanted with the girl's mother. "We need to get the girl to talk," Jake said, his voice firm. "She's the key to this. If she knows anything, anything at all, we need to hear it." The girl had been sitting quietly, her hands gripping her mother's tightly, but she looked up at the sound of Jake's voice. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was a hint of resolve in them now. I told you everything," she said softly. "I don't know what else I can say." Jake knelt down in front of her, his tone softening. "I know, kid, but you're not in this alone. We'll do everything we can to protect you and your mom. But if there's something you haven't told us, something you're holding back, now is the time to share it." The girl swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the floor. "I didn't tell you everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mom, she's not just an ordinary person. She used to work for them. The people who are after us. She was part of something secret, something dangerous. I don't know the details, but she got out. She left it all behind, but they're still looking for her." Jake's heart raced as he processed the girl's words. The woman wasn't just a victim. She was involved in something far bigger than he had imagined. And now, the people she had once worked for were coming after her, and by extension, her daughter. He stood up, turning to the crew. "We're not just fighting for them anymore," Jake said, his voice steady with resolve. "We're up against something powerful, something dangerous, and we need to get ahead of them. We can't just be reactive. We need to strike first." The crew nodded, their expressions grim. They knew what this meant. This wasn't just about saving a woman and child anymore. This was a war, and they were caught in the middle of it. Jake turned to the girl, his expression softening. "You did good," he said. "You're a lot stronger than you think." She nodded, her face still pale, but her eyes more focused. "I just want to keep my mom safe," she whispered. Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "And we will. We're going to take them down, one way or another." The bikers gathered their things, preparing for what would come next. They knew the enemy was out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for them. But now, they had the upper hand. They had the information they needed, and they were ready to move. The first step was to find out exactly what the woman had been involved in, and the second step was to stop whoever was behind this from taking anything else from them. Jake looked out into the woods again, his mind made up. He wasn't just going to protect these two. He was going to end this, once and for all. The room was thick with tension as Jake and his crew prepared for their next move. The fire had long since died down, leaving only the low murmur of voices as they discussed their plan. The girl and her mother sat quietly in the corner, the woman still unconscious, but her breathing had become more regular. Jake knew they couldn't afford to waste time. The information they had gathered from the girl had been eye-opening. Her mother wasn't just a victim. She had been a part of something far more dangerous, something that had drawn the attention of a powerful enemy. Jake's mind raced as he thought about the next step. They needed to figure out exactly who the enemy was, what they wanted, and how to stop them. The woman's mysterious past had just opened up a whole new world of danger, and they were caught right in the middle of it. "We need to find out more about this group," Jake said, his voice firm. "If they're really this dangerous, we need to be prepared. We can't just keep reacting. We need to strike first." Bear, always the more cautious one, nodded. "I agree. But how do we get the intel we need? We don't have much to go on, and every move we make is a risk." Jake looked over at the girl. "We keep asking questions. We get her to tell us everything she knows. She's the only one who can help us understand what's going on." The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a hint of determination in her gaze now. I don't know what else I can tell you," she said softly. "I don't even understand all of it. I only know that they've been after us for a long time. My mom, she left that life behind, but they won't let her go." Jake kneeled in front of her, his expression softening. "You're doing great," he said. "We just need to know as much as you can remember. Anything at all, could help." The girl took a deep breath and nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched her mother's hand. "There's one thing," she said slowly. "A name. A man who's been involved with my mom's past. He's the one who's been trying to find her. His name is Victor." Jake's mind clicked into overdrive at the mention of the name. He'd heard of Victor before. He was a notorious figure, rumored to be part of an underground organization that dealt in everything from arms trafficking to human smuggling. Victor was known for his ruthlessness, and anyone who crossed him had a way of disappearing. "Victor," Jake repeated, his voice dark with recognition. "We're dealing with someone dangerous, someone who has the resources to find people, no matter how hard they try to hide." Bear let out a low whistle. "This just got a whole lot more complicated." Jake nodded. "Yeah, it did. But it also gives us a target. If Victor's involved, then we know exactly who we're up against." The crew gathered around, their faces grim as they processed the information. The stakes had just been raised, and now they had a name that could lead them directly to the heart of this twisted web. But even with this new lead, Jake knew they couldn't rush in blindly. They needed to gather more intel, and they needed to move carefully. "We don't have time to waste," Jake said, his voice resolute. "But we can't go in without a plan. We need to find Victor and get answers. And we need to do it before he finds us." The crew nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "What's the plan, boss?" Bear asked. Jake thought for a moment, then turned to his crew. "We'll split up," he said. "Two of us will go to the last known location of Victor's operations. The rest of us will stay here, Keep watch, and make sure no one follows us. If we can find where he's hiding, we'll have the upper hand. And if things go south? Phantom asked, his expression hardening. If things go south, we fight, Jake said without hesitation. We're not backing down now. Not after everything we've been through. This ends tonight, one way or another. The crew began preparing for the split, gathering their gear and making sure they were ready for whatever lay ahead. The girl and her mother sat quietly, the tension in the air thick. The girl was visibly shaken, but Jake could see the resolve in her eyes now. She was ready to fight for her mother, ready to face the darkness that had followed them for so long. Jake walked over to the girl and knelt down in front of her again. You're doing great, he said softly. We're going to stop this, I promise. We're going to make sure you and your mom are safe. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude, but there was still fear there too. Thank you, she whispered. Jake gave her a reassuring smile before standing up and turning to his crew. Let's move out, he said, his voice steady. Time to end this. As the bikers readied themselves, the tension in the cabin mounted. The quiet of the woods around them was eerily still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The battle was coming, and Jake knew that everything they had done so far had led them to this moment. There would be no turning back now. This was their chance to take control and finally face the enemy head-on. The crew was ready. Jake was ready, and they were going to finish this once and for all. The sound of engines cut through the still night air as Jake and his crew sped down the winding road, their motorcycles roaring to life as they moved closer to their target. The cabin, their temporary refuge, was now a distant memory, and with each mile, they were getting closer to the heart of the danger. They had a plan, but the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on Jake's shoulders. The crew was ready for anything, but they all knew that the battle ahead would not be easy. The girl's mother had been through hell, and now, they were going to confront the people who had dragged her back into the nightmare she had been trying to escape. Jake glanced at the girl, who sat behind him on his bike, clutching onto him for support. Her eyes were still wide with fear, but there was a fire in them now, a determination that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting. Jake admired her courage. In the back of his mind, he knew that this wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about them. It was about survival. As they neared their destination, the tension among the crew grew. The road ahead became more treacherous, winding through thick woods and over hills that seemed to drop into darkness. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars. He could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on him. His mind was focused, but there was always that nagging feeling in the back of his head, the feeling that they were walking right into a trap. As they approached the clearing where they knew Victor's operations were rumored to be hidden, Jake signaled to the crew to slow down. They needed to approach this carefully. The last thing they needed was to make a loud entrance. They had no idea what kind of security Victor had set up, or how many people were waiting for them. It was too risky to go in without a plan. Jake turned to Bear, the most seasoned of the crew, his face set in determination. You and Phantom take the east side, Jake said, his voice low. We'll go around the other way. We'll need to flank them, not give them a chance to know what hit them. Bear nodded, his face grim. Got it. We'll move fast. Jake glanced at the girl, who was now sitting on the bike, ready to go. You stay close to us, he said. We'll keep you safe. She nodded, though her face was pale with worry. She had seen enough violence in her young life, but now she was going to face it head-on, just like the rest of them. They continued their ride, each of them on edge as they made their way toward the compound. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the faint scent of gasoline from their bikes. The silence between them spoke volumes. No one needed to say anything. They all knew what was at stake. As they neared the compound, Jake's heart began to race. There, in the distance, were the shadows of the buildings. A few faint lights flickered in the dark, illuminating the perimeter just enough for them to make out the shapes of guards patrolling the area. It was clear that this place was heavily guarded. Jake motioned for the crew to stop. They needed to assess the situation and make sure they weren't walking into a trap. He slowly dismounted his bike and signaled to the others to follow. Stay low, he whispered. The crew moved in closer, their footsteps silent on the dirt path. The sound of their motorcycles was long gone, replaced by the muffled rustling of leaves and the distant hum of a generator. As they neared the edge of the compound, Jake could see two guards standing near a makeshift gate. Their backs were turned, but Jake knew they wouldn't stay that way for long. This was their moment. On my signal, Jake whispered, we take them down. The rest of the crew nodded, positioning themselves for the strike. Jake's pulse quickened. He felt the adrenaline flooding his veins. The moment he'd been preparing for had finally arrived. He turned to the girl. Stay here, out of sight, he said firmly. We'll get her out. I promise. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. Please, make sure she's okay, she whispered. Jake gave her a quick nod and turned back to his crew. Now, with a single motion, the bikers moved in. Bear and Phantom charged toward the guards on the east side, their movements swift and silent. Jake and the others followed, flanking the guards from the other side. In an instant, they were on top of them. The guards didn't know what hit them. One was knocked out cold, the other pinned to the ground, his hands quickly bound by Jake. No noise, Jake growled, his voice low. The rest of the crew quickly secured the perimeter, ensuring that no one else would interfere. They had only moments before the rest of Victor's people arrived. Jake moved quickly, signaling to the girl's mother. She was still unconscious, but breathing steadily. They had to get her to safety, and fast. Move out, Jake barked, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had been in too many fights to count. The bikers swiftly carried the woman out of the compound, their movements precise and calculated. Every second counted now. As they reached the bikes, Jake's eyes flicked back to the compound. The sound of more footsteps echoed in the distance. They had to go now. They loaded the woman onto one of the bikes, and the crew mounted their own, ready for the next phase of the mission. Jake's mind raced. They had come this far, but the real battle was just beginning. They were about to go up against Victor, and this time, there would be no turning back. The sound of motorcycles grew louder as Jake and his crew sped through the winding roads, leaving the compound far behind them. The woman, still unconscious, was secured on one of the bikes, with the girl riding close behind her. The urgency in the air was thick. They had just barely escaped with their lives, and they couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. The mission wasn't over. They had learned something critical, but now they had to deal with the consequences. Jake glanced over at the girl, her face still pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was also a fire in them now. She had seen the darkness that had been chasing her and her mother for so long, and now, with each passing mile, she was becoming more and more a part of this fight. They weren't just running anymore. They were pushing back. Jake's mind raced as the bikes cut through the darkened roads. The girl's revelation about Victor had changed everything. This wasn't just a random group of criminals. They were up against something far more organized, a network that reached deep into the shadows. They had to be strategic, and they had to be quick. The further they rode, the more Jake realized that the group's pursuit was inevitable. They had a target on their backs now. They could run for a while, but eventually, they'd have to face Victor and his people head-on. There was no running forever. It was time to take the fight to them. As they reached a quieter stretch of road, Jake signaled for the group to slow down. They couldn't risk attracting more attention. The crew pulled over to the side of the road, and the bikes came to a stop, engines rumbling in the still night air. Jake dismounted and turned to the others. We've got a few hours before the sun comes up, Jake said, his voice low and steady. We need to figure out our next move. We've been reacting to everything so far, but we can't keep doing that. It's time to go on the offensive. Bear, ever the strategist, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area. What's the plan, boss? Jake took a deep breath, thinking through their options. We find out where Victor's hiding, where his people are. We get in, get the intel, and get out. We can't afford to stay in one place too long, but we also can't let them think they have the upper hand. They've been pulling the strings for too long. It's our turn to control the game. I'm with you, Bear replied, nodding. But what about the girl's mom? We need to get her to a doctor. Jake looked over at the woman, still unconscious on the back of the bike. We'll find a way. She's strong. She'll pull through. But we can't just sit around waiting for Victor to come knocking. We need to move fast. The girl, who had been quietly sitting by her mother's side, stood up and looked at Jake. What do we do now? Are we going to fight them? Her voice was small, but there was a quiet determination in it. Jake knelt down in front of her, looking her in the eyes. Yes, we're going to fight. We'll keep you and your mom safe. I promise. The girl nodded, a small tear slipping down her cheek. I just want my mom to be okay. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. She will be. We're not letting anyone take her from us. As the crew geared up and prepared to head out again, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was closing in on them, that they were running out of time. But he also knew they couldn't let fear dictate their actions. They had come this far, and they weren't going to back down now. Let's go, Jake said, his voice calm and commanding. We've got a fight ahead of us, and it's time we start taking the battle to them. The crew mounted their bikes, ready for whatever came next. The roar of the engines echoed in the night as they began their journey toward the unknown. Every mile they rode brought them closer to Victor and his people, but Jake wasn't afraid. He had his crew, and they were ready. They had the advantage now, and they were going to use it. The night seemed to stretch out forever as they rode, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Jake's heart raced with adrenaline, but he stayed focused, scanning the road ahead. They couldn't afford to make mistakes now. They were on the edge, and they couldn't afford to fall. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, they reached their destination, a large, industrial building on the outskirts of town. It was exactly what they had been expecting. A hidden fortress where Victor's operations ran in the shadows. The place was silent, but Jake knew that silence wouldn't last long. They were about to make their move. This is it, Jake said, his voice steady. We find what we need, and we get out. Fast. The bikers dismounted, their movements swift and practiced. Jake looked at the girl one last time. Stay close, he said. We won't let anything happen to you. She nodded, her face determined, but still filled with the fear of the unknown. As they approached the building, the air seemed to thicken with danger. They were walking straight into the heart of the storm. But Jake wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint light over the industrial complex where Jake and his crew had just arrived. The building loomed ahead, its metal walls rusted and worn, giving off the eerie impression of something long abandoned. But Jake knew better. This was no forgotten warehouse. This was Victor's fortress. Every instinct in him screamed that they were walking straight into a trap, but there was no turning back now. They had come too far, and the stakes were too high. He glanced over his shoulder at the girl, still holding her mother's hand. She was visibly nervous, but there was something stronger in her eyes now, something that reflected the same resolve Jake had seen in the crew. She wasn't just running anymore. She was facing the enemy head-on. Jake turned back to his crew, his voice steady as he addressed them. We get in, get the intel, and get out. No unnecessary risks. We don't know what we're dealing with in there. Bear, as always, was first to speak up. Understood, boss. We move fast, stay quiet, and make sure we don't get caught off guard. Phantom, the quiet but deadly member of the crew, adjusted his gloves and nodded. We won't let anything happen to her, he said, motioning toward the girl. We'll keep her safe. Jake felt a surge of gratitude for his crew. They weren't just fighters, they were family, and they would do whatever it took to protect those who needed it. Let's go, Jake said, his voice low but commanding. The group moved in formation, with Jake leading the way. As they neared the entrance, the silence of the morning seemed almost unnatural. The only sounds were their footsteps and the faint hum of the building's generators. Jake motioned for the crew to stop just before they reached the door. We need to be prepared for anything, he whispered. This could be a lot more dangerous than we think. They all nodded, their faces hard with determination. It wasn't the first time they'd walked into a hostile situation, but something about this felt different. The danger wasn't just in the building. It was in everything they had learned about Victor and his people. They were dealing with a network of criminals who had no qualms about using anyone, especially the innocent, to get what they wanted. Jake's hand went to the radio clipped to his vest. Bear, Phantom, take the left side. Wrench, Diesel, head to the right. We'll meet in the middle. Keep an eye out for anything unusual. The crew split off into their respective positions, each one moving with the precision that only years of experience could provide. Jake led the girl and her mother toward the center of the building, his eyes scanning every corner as they moved deeper into the complex. The walls were covered in grime and dirt, the dim lighting casting shadows that seemed to move with every step they took. It was clear this place had been in use for years, and Jake had no doubt it was a hub for whatever illegal operations Victor was running. They reached a large room at the center of the building. It looked like an office, but the heavy metal doors and security systems told Jake that this was more than just a place for paperwork. He motioned for the girl and her mother to stay behind him as he approached the door. His heart raced as he reached for the handle, knowing that once they stepped inside, there would be no going back. The door creaked open slowly, and Jake's eyes immediately went to the far side of the room. There, behind a large desk, sat Victor. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto Jake's as the door swung open. For a moment, neither man moved, as if sizing the other up. Victor was tall, with an air of confidence that came from years of ruthless dealings. His suit was immaculate, but the coldness in his eyes told Jake all he needed to know. This wasn't a man who feared anything. This was a man who controlled everything. "You shouldn't have come here," Victor said, his voice smooth and calm, but with an underlying threat. "You've made a mistake." Jake stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his gun, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet. You're the one who made the mistake," Jake said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "You've been hunting the wrong people." Victor chuckled, the sound cold and devoid of humor. "Hunting? I don't hunt. I collect. I collect people, power, control. And you," he said, his eyes narrowing, "are nothing more than an inconvenience." The air between them thickened with tension. Jake knew that this was it, the moment everything had been leading to. If they didn't handle this carefully, they would lose everything. "We're not leaving here without answers," Jake said, his voice steely. Victor stood slowly, his hand moving to a drawer in his desk. "You should have thought about that before you decided to interfere," he said, pulling out a small device. Jake's instincts flared. Whatever Victor was about to do, it wasn't good. "Get down," Jake shouted, pushing the girl and her mother to the ground. As he dove for cover, the room erupted into chaos as the device in Victor's hand began to emit a high-pitched noise, signaling something Jake had feared, a silent alarm. Reinforcements were on their way. "We need to move, now," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. The crew responded instantly, moving into action as they fought to keep the situation under control. But Jake knew one thing for sure. The clock was ticking, and this fight was far from over. The high-pitched alarm blared through the room as Jake pushed the girl and her mother to the ground. His crew scrambled for cover, their bodies moving instinctively as gunfire erupted from the shadows. The metal walls of the room reverberated with the sound of impacts, the tension crackling in the air like electricity. Jake's heart raced, his eyes flicking over the scene as he tried to assess the situation. Victor had set this trap perfectly. The reinforcements were already on their way, and every second they stayed here was another second closer to being overwhelmed. Jake couldn't afford to waste time. "We need to move, now," Jake barked, his voice commanding. He looked at his crew, each of them already on edge, ready to spring into action. Bear and Phantom were already covering their positions, their eyes sharp as they moved to block the entrances. Diesel and Wrench, always the muscle, were ready to make a push for the back exit. The girl, though terrified, kept close to her mother, her grip tight as she looked up at Jake with wide eyes. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Jake didn't have time to sugarcoat things. "We're under attack," he said firmly, though his gaze softened as he met her eyes. "We're getting you out of here. Stay low, and stay close to me." The girl nodded, fear still evident, but there was something else in her eyes now, resolve. She was ready to fight. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just about saving the woman anymore. It was about fighting back, taking control. As Jake surveyed the room, his mind worked fast. The building was massive, its walls lined with security cameras, and the exits were heavily guarded. They had to move fast, but they couldn't just charge in recklessly. The situation demanded strategy. "Bear, Phantom," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold the door. Don't let anyone through. Wrench, Diesel, with me. We need to get to the back room." "On it," Bear shouted back, his deep voice steady despite the madness around him. He and Phantom moved to the door, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning for any movement. The rest of the crew prepared for the worst. Jake turned to the girl one more time, his voice low and intense. "You stick close. We'll get through this, but you have to trust us." The girl nodded, her face set with determination. Jake turned back to the task at hand, signaling for his crew to follow. The room was filled with the sound of gunfire and shuffling footsteps as Jake and the crew moved toward the back of the building. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Jake knew every corner could hide an enemy. He stepped lightly, his senses sharp as he moved through the space, his eyes darting to every shadow. They couldn't afford to be ambushed again. As they rounded a corner, Jake's instincts flared. He barely had time to react before a figure appeared from behind a stack of crates. "Freeze!" the figure shouted, raising a weapon in their direction. But before they could react, Bear and Phantom were already on them, knocking the weapon from the person's hand and pinning them to the ground. "Not today," Phantom muttered, keeping the figure subdued. Jake stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the attacker. "Who are you?" he demanded. The person, a man in his mid-30s with a hard look in his eyes, snarled. "You don't know who you're messing with. You'll never get out of here alive." Jake crouched down, his face inches from the man's. "I'm not here to play games. Where's Victor? Where are his people?" The man spat on the ground, still defiant. "You're too late," he sneered. "Victor's already made his move. There's no escape now." Jake's blood ran cold. Victor had planned for everything. But Jake wasn't about to back down. He grabbed the man by the collar, pulling him up until their faces were inches apart. "You're going to tell me everything you know. Now." The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he didn't speak. Jake knew they didn't have time for this. He turned to Bear, giving him a silent nod. Without hesitation, Bear lifted the man off the ground and slammed him back down. The man grunted in pain, but refused to speak. Jake clenched his jaw. "Last chance. Where's Victor?" The man's resolve finally cracked. "He's in the back," he muttered, defeated. "But you won't get to him. There are too many of us." Jake didn't wait for more. He motioned for the crew to move forward. "Keep your eyes open. This ends tonight." As they moved deeper into the building, the air grew thicker with tension. They were getting closer. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, each step bringing them closer to Victor. His mind raced, but he pushed the fear aside. They had a job to do, and they weren't leaving without finishing it. The hallway ahead was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long against the walls. Jake's crew moved in tight formation, every step calculated, every sound amplified. They were close, too close. And then, as they rounded the final corner, they saw him. Victor was standing at the end of the hall, a cold smile on his face as he watched them approach. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "But I'm afraid it's too late. You're already too deep in." Jake's grip tightened around his weapon. "This ends now, Victor." Victor's smile was cold, like he knew something the rest of them didn't. The air between them crackled with tension as Jake's crew closed in, weapons ready. Jake could feel his heart pounding, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They had come too far to back down now. They were in the lion's den, and there was no turning back. "You're too late," Victor said, his voice almost lazy, as if he were in control of everything. "You've been playing catch-up this whole time. You think you can take me down? This game is over, Jake." Jake's grip tightened on his weapon, his voice low and steady. "The game ends when I say it ends, Victor. This is it. You're not walking away from this." Victor's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move, seemingly unbothered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he sneered. "I have people everywhere. You think you can just storm in and destroy everything I've built?" Jake stepped forward, his eyes locked on Victor's, unwavering. "You've destroyed enough lives. You've hurt the wrong people. And now, you're going to pay." Victor chuckled darkly. "You think you can stop me? You're just a group of bikers, with no real power. I run things here. I control everything." "Not anymore," Jake shot back. "It's over." In that moment, everything seemed to happen at once. The door behind them burst open with a violent crash, and armed men flooded the hallway. Jake's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't hesitate. His crew was ready. Bear and Phantom immediately opened fire, their shots landing with precision as they took down the first wave of attackers. Jake ducked behind a pillar, firing back as chaos erupted around them. The sounds of gunshots, shouted commands, and the heavy thud of boots hitting the concrete filled the air. Jake's focus remained on Victor, but he couldn't ignore the mayhem surrounding them. The crew had to hold their ground, or they wouldn't make it out alive. He could see the girl, standing at the edge of the hallway, her eyes wide with terror. She was too close to the crossfire. "Get her out of here," Jake shouted to Wrench, who was closest to the girl. Wrench immediately moved, rushing toward her and pulling her to safety behind cover. "Stay down," Wrench barked at her, his voice sharp as they crouched low to avoid the gunfire. Victor's men were relentless, but Jake's crew was faster, their training kicking in as they systematically eliminated the threat. The hallways grew quieter, the sounds of the battle slowly dying down. But Jake knew it wasn't over. Not yet. He didn't trust Victor's cocky attitude. There had to be more to this. As the final attacker fell, Jake moved forward, keeping his gun aimed at Victor. "You've lost," Jake said, his voice cold. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in Victor's eyes. "It's over." Victor's smile faded, replaced by a grimace of rage. "You have no idea what's coming," he spat. "You may have won this battle, but there are forces out there that will." Before Victor could finish, Jake moved fast, closing the distance between them. "No more lies," Jake said. "No more threats." With that, Jake knocked Victor's weapon out of his hand, the metallic clatter echoing in the now silent hallway. Victor stumbled back, eyes wide with fury. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "I have connections. I'm untouchable. You'll never get rid of me." Jake's eyes narrowed, his resolve unshaken. "We're not done. We'll make sure your network crumbles." With one final movement, Jake shoved Victor back into the wall, pinning him there. "And as for you," Jake said, "you're done. You're going to answer for everything you've done." Victor's face twisted with anger and fear, but it was clear to Jake that his reign of terror was over. As the crew gathered around, securing Victor and his men, Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This had been more than just a mission. It had been a fight for justice, for the safety of the girl, her mother, and countless others who had suffered under Victor's control. The girl stood up, her face still a little pale but filled with a new sense of strength. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice soft. Jake nodded, offering a small smile. "It's over. You and your mom are safe now." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but there was a sense of relief in her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Jake nodded again, turning to his crew. "Let's get them out of here. This place isn't safe anymore." As they moved to secure Victor's remaining resources and ensure the girl and her mother were safely on their way, Jake allowed himself a moment to breathe. The mission had been a success. The nightmare was over, but Jake knew that as long as people like Victor existed, the fight for justice would never truly end. For now, though, they had won. And that was enough. In this thrilling tale of resilience and justice, follow the journey of a group of bikers as they fight against a dangerous network of criminals in the gripping Hell Angel stories. With each twist and turn, the bikers must protect a young girl and her mother from a powerful villain, Victor, who is determined to destroy everything in his path. The stakes are high as the bikers navigate through dark alleys, industrial buildings, and dangerous situations, all while uncovering hidden truths and secrets that shake them to their core. The Hell Angels stories reveal not only the intense action and danger, but also the bonds of loyalty and courage that bind the bikers together as they confront their greatest adversary yet. As they make their way through the perilous fight, the girl and her mother become more than just victims. They become symbols of hope, strength, and the will to survive. The battle against Victor and his organization escalates to a final showdown, and the bikers are forced to make difficult decisions that will shape their future. These Hell Angels stories are packed with heart-pounding moments, unexpected twists, and a relentless pursuit of justice that will keep you on the edge of your seat. From the moment the bikers hit the road, you will be immersed in a world where loyalty, family, and survival are everything. Don't miss the action, emotion, and high stakes in these unforgettable Hell Angels stories, where the fight for what's right is never over.